My name is Tatiana, a 28-year-old graphic designer from Boston. All my life, I felt second best to my brother James. No matter what I achieved, it was never enough for my parents' attention. But last month, everything changed when James received a luxury birthday weekend in Aspen, while I got a card saying maybe next year. That was the moment I decided enough was enough and booked a one-way flight that transformed my life forever. Before I tell you how I rebuilt my life from scratch, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. Growing up in our affluent Connecticut neighborhood, I always knew something was different about how my parents treated me compared to my older brother James. Our family looked perfect from the outside, with my father William being a successful attorney at a prestigious law firm in Hartford, and my mother Catherine working as a hospital administrator. We lived in a beautiful colonial-style home with a perfectly manicured lawn and took annual vacations to Martha's Vineyard. The American dream, right wrong. Behind closed doors, the stark contrast in how they treated their two children was impossible to ignore. James is 3 years older than me, and from my earliest memories, he was clearly the golden child. When James turned 10, he received a top-of-the-line mountain bike that cost over $1,000. 2 years later, when I turned 10, I got a hand-me-down bike from our cousin, with the promise that if I took good care of it, maybe I could get a new one next year. That maybe next year phrase became a running theme throughout my childhood. School achievements highlighted the disparity even more clearly. I was always a straight-A student, often staying up late to ensure my work was perfect. My report cards would be met with a quick "good job, Tatiana," before the conversation immediately shifted to how James was doing in his classes. When James brought home B-plus grades, my parents would celebrate by taking him out to his favorite restaurant. My academic excellence became expected unremarkable. The pattern continued through high school. James got the newest iPhone model each year, while I continued using my old one until it literally stopped working. When I finally worked up the courage to ask why, my mother simply said James needed to stay connected with his many friends and activities, implying that I, with my smaller social circle, didn't have the same needs. College decisions brought the inequality into even sharper focus. James received a full ride to Dartmouth with our parents, covering his apartment meal plan, textbooks, and giving him a generous monthly allowance. When my acceptance to Boston University came with a partial scholarship, I was told I would need to work part-time to cover the difference. My parents explained that they had already spent so much on James' education that they needed to be practical about mine. After graduating with honors while working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop, I decided to stay in Boston rather than moving back to Connecticut. I found a small apartment with a roommate and landed an entry-level position at a design firm. The physical distance from my family provided some emotional relief, but holiday gatherings and family events continued to reinforce my outsider status. Every Christmas, James would receive thoughtful, expensive gifts, while I received practical items like kitchen towels or generic gift cards. Family photos always seemed to position me at the edges, almost an afterthought. Conversations centered around James, accomplishments, his girlfriend, his career trajectory, with only cursory questions about my life. Despite the clear pattern, I kept trying to earn their approval. I worked overtime to secure promotions. I dated men they might approve of. I called regularly and remembered every birthday and anniversary. I convinced myself that if I just achieved enough, they would finally see me as worthy of the same love and attention they lavished on James. When I was 26, I finally gathered my courage and confronted my mother during a weekend visit home. I carefully listed examples of the different treatment, trying to remain calm and factual. "Tatiana, you are being too sensitive," she said dismissively. "We love both our children equally. James just needs more support and guidance than you do. You have always been so independent and capable." That was the first time I realized that my competence had become my curse. By not falling apart, by succeeding despite the lack of support, I had somehow justified their neglect in their minds. That night, I cried myself to sleep in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the plain furniture that contrasted sharply with James' room full of trophies and memorabilia my parents had carefully preserved. I returned to Boston with a heavy heart, but continued the pattern of seeking approval for another year and a half. Each family gathering brought fresh wounds, but I kept showing up hoping for change. Looking back now, I realize I was trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment that was slowly eroding my self-worth. As my 28th birthday approached last spring, I tried to manage my expectations. History had taught me not to hope for much, but somewhere deep inside, a small part of me still wished this year might be different. 6 weeks earlier, my brother James had celebrated his 31st birthday with an extravagant weekend in Aspen, Colorado. I knew this because my Instagram and Facebook feeds were flooded with photos my parents proudly shared of the luxury hotel suite with mountain views, James grinning in professional ski lessons, and elaborate meals at five-star restaurants. My mother even called me specifically to describe how they had surprised him with first-class plane tickets, and how James' face lit up when he saw the itinerary. "That must have been amazing," I said, swallowing my hurt. "Is there anything special you guys want to do for my birthday next month?" "Honey, we will definitely do something nice," my mother assured me. "Your father and I have been a bit stretched thin after James' trip, but we will make it special, I promise." I allowed myself a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe they had reflected on the disparity and were planning to make amends. Maybe this would be the year things changed. The week before my birthday, my mother called to invite me to dinner at their house. This meant a 3-hour drive each way from Boston to Connecticut. But I agreed immediately. Perhaps they had planned a special home-cooked meal, or a small gathering of family friends. I took Friday off work, spent hours selecting the perfect outfit, and even got my hair trimmed for the occasion. The drive to Connecticut was filled with nervous anticipation. As I pulled into their driveway, I noticed only my parents' cars were there, no signs of any surprise gathering. My mother greeted me with a quick hug at the door. "Happy birthday, sweetie. Your father is in his study finishing up some work. Dinner will be ready in about 30 minutes." I settled into the living room, looking around for any signs of birthday decorations or gifts. There were none. When my father finally emerged, he gave me a distracted hello and immediately turned on the television to check the stock market. Dinner was my mother's standard pot roast, not even my favorite meal. As we ate, my parents discussed their neighbor's recent renovation and my father's upcoming golf tournament. Neither mentioned my birthday until dessert, when my mother brought out a store-bought cake with no candles. After we finished eating, my mother handed me a sealed envelope. "This is from your father and me. We hope you like it." Inside was a generic birthday card, the kind you buy from a grocery store display. There was no gift card, no check, not even a personal note, just the pre-printed message and their signatures. But there, in my mother's handwriting, was a postscript that made my stomach drop. "Maybe next year we can do something special like we did for James." I stared at those words, reading them over and over as the full weight of their meaning sank in. Maybe next year. The same empty promise that had followed me throughout my childhood, now explicitly comparing me to my brother. I somehow maintained my composure through coffee, nodding and smiling automatically, while inside I was crumbling. The final blow came when my father pulled out his phone. "Have I shown you the photos from James' birthday trip?" The hotel upgraded them to the presidential suite when they found out it was a special occasion. For the next 20 minutes, I was forced to admire countless photos of my brother's luxury weekend that my parents had spent approximately $15,000 on, based on the details they proudly shared. $15,000 for James, a grocery store card for me, with the promise of maybe next year. I made an excuse about needing to get back to Boston that night for an early meeting the next day. My mother looked disappointed, but didn't try very hard to convince me to stay. The drive home was a blur of tears and anger. I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see the road through my crying. Back in my apartment, I stared at the card again, running my fingers over the words "maybe next year." 28 years of next years that never came. 28 years of being less than, of trying to earn love that should have been freely given. 28 years of accepting the unacceptable. Something broke in me that night, but something else awakened. I opened my laptop and began researching cities far from Boston, far from the orbit of my family. Places where I could restart, without the shadow of being the less loved child. Seattle caught my eye with its thriving design scene and completely opposite location from my current life. At 3 in the morning, with a clarity I had never felt before, I booked a one-way ticket to Seattle for 2 weeks later. As the confirmation email arrived in my inbox, I felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. The 2 weeks between booking my flight and actually leaving were a whirlwind of secret preparations. I gave notice at my design firm, but negotiated a remote freelance position for 3 months to ensure I would have some income while establishing myself in Seattle. My supervisor was surprisingly understanding, even helping me connect with a former colleague who had relocated to the Pacific Northwest. I listed my furniture on Marketplace and scheduled pickup dates for each piece. My apartment lease fortunately had only 2 months remaining, and I arranged to sublet it to a friend of a coworker who needed temporary housing. Each item I sold, each arrangement I made felt like cutting another cord, tethering me to my old life. Finding housing in Seattle from across the country was challenging, but I managed to secure a tiny studio apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood with a 6-month lease. It was overpriced and half the size of my Boston place, but it represented freedom, and that was worth every penny. Throughout these preparations, I told only one person about my plans, my best friend Maya. We met for coffee at our favorite spot in Boston Common the weekend before my departure. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Maya asked, as we sat on a bench watching joggers circle the park. "This is so sudden, Tatiana. I have never been more certain of anything," I replied, surprising myself with my conviction. I showed her the birthday card which I had been carrying around like evidence of a crime. Maya read it and looked up with tears in her eyes. "I always knew your family situation was difficult, but this is so much worse than I imagined. The explicit comparison to your brother is just cruel." I nodded, throat tight with emotion. 28 years of this, Maya. I can't do it anymore. I can't keep hoping they will suddenly see me as worthy. She hugged me fiercely. "Then go find people who already know your worth without you having to prove it constantly." That afternoon, my parents called to ask why I wasn't coming to Sunday dinner, a monthly tradition I rarely missed. I made an excuse about work deadlines, but promised to call them soon. The lie felt strange on my tongue, but I wasn't ready for the confrontation until all my plans were secured. 3 days before my flight, with my apartment nearly empty and most arrangements finalized, I finally called my parents to tell them the truth. My father answered, and I asked him to put the phone on speaker so both my parents could hear me. "I have something important to tell you." I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "I am moving to Seattle on Thursday. I have already given notice at my job, found an apartment there, and booked a one-way flight." The silence that followed was deafening. Then both started speaking at once. "What are you talking about?" my father demanded. "Is this some kind of joke? You can't just uproot your life on a whim." "Tatiana." "This is so irresponsible," my mother added. "What about your job?" "Your apartment." "You haven't thought this through." "I actually have thought it through very carefully," I replied. "I have a remote contract with my current firm for 3 months. I found someone to sublet my apartment, and I've secured housing in Seattle. This isn't a whim, it's a decision I've made for my well-being." "This is about the birthday, isn't it?" my mother sighed. "You're being so dramatic over a simple dinner. We told you we couldn't do much this year after James' trip." "It's not just about the birthday," I said, though that was certainly the final straw. "It's about 28 years of feeling like an afterthought in this family. It's about never being enough. It's about maybe next year, written in a card when James got a $15,000 ski vacation." "You're exaggerating the cost," my father interrupted. "And comparing what we do for you and your brother isn't fair. Different children have different needs." "You're right," I responded. "And my need is to be somewhere I can rebuild my sense of self-worth, away from constant reminders of my second-place status in this family." The conversation devolved from there, with my father dismissing my feelings as a dramatic overreaction, and my mother cycling between guilt-tripping attempts and defensive justifications. Neither actually asked me not to go because I mattered to them. They talked about appearances, about what family members would think, about how holiday gatherings would be awkward, but not once about missing me personally. After I hung up, my brother James called, something that rarely happened unless prompted by our parents. "Mom and Dad are really upset," he began without preamble. "They say you're moving across the country because of some perceived slight. I wouldn't call a lifetime of differential treatment a slight." "James," I replied wearily. Come on, sis. We both know they love us equally, he said, sounding uncomfortable. They just show it differently. Do you really believe that I asked? Did you know that for my birthday this year, all I got was a card saying maybe next year they could do something special for me, like they did for you in Aspen? The silence that followed told me he hadn't known, or at least hadn't considered, how it would feel from my perspective. I didn't ask them to spend that much on me, he finally said defensively. And I didn't ask to be treated like an afterthought my entire life, I countered. I'm not blaming you, James. This isn't about you. It's about me finally doing what's right for me. By the time we hung up, it was clear that even James, who had benefited from the inequality all these years, couldn't genuinely defend it once confronted with the stark reality. His parting words were a half-hearted, "Let me know when you get there safely," the first indication that perhaps some genuine concern for me existed beneath the surface of our strained relationship. The night before my flight, doubt crept in as I lay on a borrowed air mattress in my nearly empty apartment. Was I overreacting? Was I running away rather than facing my problems? The familiar voice of self-doubt, the one that had been reinforced by years of gaslighting from my family, whispered that I was making a terrible mistake. But then I remembered the card, the words "maybe next year" mocking all my previous years of patient hoping. I remembered the pride in my parents' voices as they described James' presidential suite upgrade while I sat there with my grocery store card. I remembered a lifetime of being less than. No, I wasn't running away. I was running toward something better, toward the possibility of a life where my worth wasn't constantly in question. With that clarity restored, I finally fell asleep ready to board the flight that would change everything. The Seattle rain greeted me as I exited SeaTac Airport, a stark contrast to the clear Boston spring I had left behind. It felt appropriate somehow, as if the city were washing away my past life. The Uber driver who took me to my new apartment was chatty, pointing out landmarks and offering restaurant recommendations. His friendliness was a welcome distraction from the enormity of what I had just done. My studio apartment in Capitol Hill was even smaller than it had appeared in photos, barely 400 square feet, with a kitchenette tucked into one corner and a bathroom so compact I could touch all four walls without moving. But the large window offered a glimpse of the Seattle skyline in the distance, and more importantly, it was mine, a space where no one could make me feel less than. That first night was the hardest. After the Uber driver helped me carry my 2 suitcases upstairs and departed with a cheerful good luck, the silence was deafening. I sat on the floor surrounded by my few possessions, 3,000 miles from everything familiar, and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. I had no furniture yet, no friends nearby, no job to go to in the morning. The freedom I had sought suddenly felt like isolation. I slept on a pile of clothes that night using my coat as a blanket. In the morning, the persistent Seattle drizzle matched my mood as I ventured out to find a coffee shop with Wi-Fi so I could start ordering basic necessities and figuring out where to buy an affordable mattress. That first week passed in a blur of practical tasks, each small accomplishment rebuilding my confidence bit by bit. I found a secondhand furniture store and negotiated delivery of a bed, a desk, and a small dining table. I located the nearest grocery store and laundromat. I mapped out running routes for morning exercise. I established a workspace at my tiny desk for my remote freelance projects. But the silence of the apartment each evening was crushing. I had never lived completely alone before, and the solitude gave me too much time to question my decision. My parents had called twice, conversations I kept brief and superficial. "Your father and I are still very upset about how you handled this," my mother said during the second call. "You could have discussed it with us before making such a rash decision." I didn't point out that every major decision in my life had been met with indifference unless it inconvenienced them. Instead, I simply said I needed to do this for myself and changed the subject. By the second week, I knew I needed to find some community or risk spiraling into regret. I searched for local design meetups and found one happening at a co-working space downtown. Walking into that room of strangers took more courage than I thought I possessed, but desperation pushed me forward. "Hi, I'm Tatiana. I just moved here from Boston," I said to the first friendly face. I saw a woman with bright blue hair arranging name tags on a table. "Welcome to Seattle." "I'm Alyssa, the organizer," she replied with genuine warmth. "Is this your first design event here?" That simple exchange began my integration into Seattle's design community. By the end of the evening, I had exchanged contact information with 3 other designers and received leads on potential local clients. More importantly, I had spent 2 hours talking about work and creativity without once feeling judged or diminished. I attended every design event I could find over the next few weeks, slowly building a professional network. My remote work from the Boston firm kept me financially afloat, but I knew I needed to establish local connections to build a sustainable future in Seattle. My breakthrough came a month after arrival, when one of my new design contacts recommended me to a local craft brewery looking to rebrand. The owner, Luis, met with me at his tap room and actually listened to my ideas, a refreshing change from my previous experiences of being talked over or dismissed. "I think you really get what we're trying to do," Luis said after I presented my initial concepts. "The other designers we talked to tried to push us toward what everyone else is doing, but you're giving us something that feels authentic to our story." That was my first independent Seattle client, the first time someone in my new city truly valued my work. The project paid well enough that I could start building savings beyond my basic expenses. More importantly, it boosted my confidence immeasurably. Maybe I really did belong here. As I established my daily routine, exploring my neighborhood in the mornings, working through afternoons, and cooking simple meals in my tiny kitchen each evening, I began to find comfort in my independence. There was freedom in having no one to please but myself, in making choices without calculating their impact on anyone else's approval of me. I discovered the joy of solo experiences, taking myself to dinner at a restaurant counter, and chatting with the bartender, spending hours in bookstores, without worrying about keeping anyone else waiting, hiking nearby trails at my own pace. I started a sketchbook of Seattle scenes, something I had always wanted to do, but never made time for when my energy was consumed by seeking approval. The owner of a coffee shop I frequented, Zoe, became my first real friend in the city. She was about my age, but with a confidence I envied, having started her business at 25, after leaving a corporate job that was crushing her spirit. "I get it," she told me one quiet afternoon as I shared parts of my story over a latte. "I left my whole life in Chicago because I needed to reinvent myself somewhere. People didn't have preconceived notions about who I was supposed to be." "Do you ever regret it?" I asked, the question that still haunted me in quiet moments. "Not for a second," she replied without hesitation. "Building a life that actually fits who you are is worth every moment of discomfort along the way." As summer arrived, I faced my first major holiday away from family. Independence Day had always been a big gathering at my parents' house, with my father grilling and neighborhood families coming by throughout the day. Despite everything, I felt a pang of nostalgia as the holiday approached. Zoe sensed my mood and invited me to join her and some friends for a rooftop barbecue with a view of the fireworks over Elliott Bay. It was there, surrounded by people who knew me only as I presented myself to them, not as the eternal afterthought in my family dynamics, that I felt the first real taste of holiday joy in years. My parents called the next day, clearly expecting me to express regret about missing the family gathering. When I instead enthusiastically described my Seattle celebration, my mother's response was tellingly brief. "Well, that sounds nice," she said flatly, before changing the subject to tell me about James bringing his new girlfriend to the family event. As the months passed, these calls became increasingly superficial. My parents asked cursory questions about my work, but never seemed to retain the information between conversations. They shared family news, but rarely asked how I was adjusting or if I needed anything. Our relationship had always been shallow, but the distance made this reality impossible to ignore. The surprise came when James began reaching out separately from our parents. At first, his texts were awkward and infrequent, but gradually he began sharing more personal thoughts and asking genuine questions about my new life. "I feel like I've never really known you," he admitted in one message. "We've always been in these roles our parents created, but I want to know who you actually are outside of all that." It was the first acknowledgement from any family member that our dynamics had been built on shaky foundations. I wasn't ready to fully trust this new version of my brother, but I allowed myself to engage cautiously, sharing selected aspects of my Seattle experience while maintaining emotional boundaries. By the 6-month mark, I had established enough local clients that I no longer needed the remote work from Boston. I had a small but genuine circle of friends. I had favorite spots throughout the city and felt comfortable navigating without GPS. Seattle was becoming home in ways Boston never had precisely, because I was building this life deliberately on my own terms. But beneath the external success, emotional exhaustion was taking its toll. Years of family dynamics don't disappear overnight, and the work of rebuilding my sense of self-worth while processing the grief of family rejection was more demanding than I had anticipated. I was pushing myself relentlessly, as if trying to prove to an absent audience that I had made the right choice. The collapse when it came was both unexpected and inevitable. 6 months and 2 weeks after my arrival in Seattle, I woke at 3 in the morning with my heart racing and unable to catch my breath. The panic attack, my first ever, was terrifying enough that I called an Uber to take me to the emergency room, convinced I was having a heart attack. Hours later, after tests ruled out physical causes, a kind doctor sat beside my bed. "Your body is telling you something important," she said gently. "All your vitals show signs of prolonged stress and exhaustion. When was the last time you truly rested?" I couldn't remember. In Boston, I'd been constantly striving to earn approval that never came. In Seattle, I'd been frantically building a new life to justify my decision. There had been no space for simply being. They admitted me for observation due to my elevated blood pressure and extreme exhaustion. When they asked for emergency contacts, I hesitated before giving them Zoe's number. Listing a coffee shop owner I'd known for months rather than my family was a stark illustration of my new reality. Zoe arrived within an hour bringing my phone charger and a change of clothes she'd retrieved using the spare key I'd given her for plant watering when I traveled for client meetings. "You should have told me you were struggling," she said, squeezing my hand. "You're not alone here anymore, Tatiana." I broke down, then finally releasing months of pent-up emotion. "I'm so tired of never being enough," I sobbed. "In Boston, I wasn't enough for my family, and here I'm terrified that if I slow down for even a moment, everything I've built will collapse." Zoe stayed with me until visiting hours ended, then promised to return the next day. That night alone in the hospital room, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the grief I'd been outrunning through sheer determination and busyness. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. My brother James was standing awkwardly in the doorway of my hospital room, looking tired and worried. "What are you doing here?" I asked, genuinely shocked. "Mom and Dad called your old design firm in Boston when they couldn't reach you for a few days," he explained. "Someone there mentioned you'd been sick and missed a deadline. I got worried and caught the first flight out." The revelation that my parents had been checking up on me through my former employer, rather than calling me directly, was painful but unsurprising. That James had actually flown across the country, however, was completely unexpected. Our reunion was uncomfortable at first. We had never been close, our relationship shaped by the roles assigned to us by our parents, with little opportunity to know each other as individuals. "Why did you really come?" I finally asked as we sat in uncomfortable hospital chairs. "Mom and Dad sent you to convince me to come back east." James looked down, then met my eyes with unusual directness. "No, they don't even know I'm here. I came because I realized something when you left." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I realized I don't know my only sister at all, and that's my loss." Over the next few hours as I waited for discharge papers, James shared perspectives on our family I had never considered. He described the crushing expectations our parents had placed on him, the pressure to justify their financial and emotional investment, the constant fear of disappointing them. "They made me the center of everything." But it wasn't actually about me, he explained. It was about their image of the perfect son. Nothing I actually wanted mattered if it didn't fit their plan. The trip to Aspen, I would have preferred a simple weekend at the cabin with friends, but they insisted because it was the kind of gift their successful son should receive. While our experiences had been vastly different, we had both been trapped in roles not of our choosing. James had received the material advantages, but had been denied autonomy. I had been denied support, but had developed independence out of necessity. "I see how they hurt you, Tatiana," he said quietly. "All those years I knew something was wrong with how they treated you, but it was easier to accept my role than to challenge the whole system." Zoe arrived as we were having this conversation, immediately positioning herself protectively by my side. I introduced them, watching cautiously as they sized each other up. "So, you're the brother," Zoe said, her tone making it clear she'd heard enough about my family to be skeptical. "Are you here to pressure Tatiana into going back?" "No," James replied, surprising me with his candor. "I'm here because I should have been a better brother long before now. Tatiana needed an ally in that house and I failed her." Zoe visibly softened at his sincerity, but maintained her protective stance. "Well, she has people who see her value now, just so you know. The discharge process took longer than expected, and during that time my parents finally called." James stepped out to speak with them privately, returning with a tense expression. "They want you to come home to Connecticut to recover," he reported. "They think this proves Seattle was a mistake." To my surprise, Zoe stepped in before I could respond. "Tatiana has a home here," she said firmly. "She has friends who care about her, and clients who value her work. What she needs is rest and support, not a cross-country flight and family stress." James looked between us, then nodded slowly. "I agree with you," he told Zoe. "I don't think going back is what Tatiana needs right now." It was the first time anyone in my family had prioritized what I actually needed over what would be most convenient or appropriate in their eyes. When I was finally discharged, James helped Zoe get me settled back in my apartment, then checked into a nearby hotel rather than assuming he would stay with me. The next few days were a turning point in my relationship with my brother. He extended his stay in Seattle, helping me organize some meal delivery services and accompanying me on short walks as I regained my strength. We talked more openly than we ever had, beginning to build a relationship based on who we actually were, rather than the roles we had been assigned. When he returned to the East Coast, we had established a foundation for a new kind of sibling relationship, one separate from our parents' influence. I remained in Seattle now with a clearer understanding that taking care of my well-being wasn't selfish, but essential. The health scare had forced me to acknowledge that building a new life required more than just professional success and physical relocation. It required emotional healing as well. The 1-year anniversary of my arrival in Seattle marked a natural point for reflection. Sitting on a bench overlooking Puget Sound, I marveled at how much had changed in 12 months. My freelance business had grown to the point where I was turning down projects and considering hiring an assistant. I had moved from my tiny studio to a 1-bedroom apartment with a small balcony and a view of the water, a space that felt truly like home. My circle of friends had expanded beyond Zoe and the design community to include neighbors, fellow hikers I'd met on weekend excursions, and members of a book club that met monthly at a local bookstore. These relationships were built on mutual interest and genuine connection, rather than obligation or shared history. A refreshing change from many of my Boston friendships that had been maintained out of habit. Perhaps most significantly, I had begun dating again this time without the voice of my parents, preferences echoing in my head. Ryan, a structural engineer I met through a mutual friend, appreciated exactly the qualities my family had dismissed: my independence, my creativity, my straightforward communication style. Our relationship developed naturally without the pressure I had always felt to make things work in order to secure family approval. When Ryan first told me he was falling in love with me, my instinctive response was disbelief. Why, I asked, genuinely puzzled that someone would choose me when I had spent a lifetime being the second choice. "Because you're brave," he replied simply. "Because you rebuilt your entire life on your own terms. Because you see the world in ways that surprise me every day. And because when you laugh, it's the most genuine sound I've ever heard." It was the first time anyone had valued me for exactly who I was, not who they wanted me to be or what I could do for them. The realization brought tears, and Ryan, unlike anyone in my family would have done, simply held me without demanding explanations or trying to fix anything. My professional breakthrough came when a campaign I designed for a local sustainable clothing brand went viral, drawing attention from larger companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. The brand's founder credited my unique approach for their 30% increase in sales, and the resulting publicity led to a flood of new client inquiries. When a Seattle design magazine requested an interview about the campaign, I experienced my first moment of true professional pride. The journalist who interviewed me seemed genuinely interested in my creative process and vision, treating me as an authority in my field, rather than someone lucky to be noticed. The article was published with the headline, "Fresh Eyes: How Transplant Designer Tatiana Turner is Reshaping Seattle Brand Narratives." Seeing my name in print associated with words like innovative and visionary was surreal after years of having my creative ideas dismissed or overlooked by my family. My parents learned about the article through social media, where distant relatives had shared it with congratulatory comments. Their call that evening was the first time they had initiated contact in weeks, a fact that spoke volumes about our deteriorating relationship. "We saw your feature in that magazine," my father began awkwardly. "It seems you're doing well out there." "Yes, I am," I replied simply. "Well, perhaps it was a good move for your career after all." He conceded the closest thing to approval he had ever offered for my Seattle decision. Instead of feeling validated by this grudging acknowledgement, I realized I no longer needed it. My success wasn't meaningful because my father finally recognized it. It was meaningful because I had built it myself on my own terms. That realization empowered me to set clearer boundaries with my parents during that call. When my mother began her usual pattern of sharing James' accomplishments while barely acknowledging mine, I interrupted gently but firmly. "Mom, I'd like to talk about something else. How's your community garden project going?" The momentary silence conveyed her surprise at my redirection, but she adjusted, and for the first time in memory, we had a conversation that wasn't centered on comparing me to my brother or subtly reinforcing family hierarchies. 3 weeks later, I flew back to Connecticut for a brief visit, my first return since leaving. The decision was deliberate, a test to see if I could maintain my newfound sense of self in the environment that had originally damaged it. My childhood home looked smaller somehow, less imposing than in my memories. My old bedroom had been converted to a home office within months of my departure, a change my mother mentioned casually, as if it were not symbolic of how quickly I had been erased. The first dinner was predictably tense, with my parents alternating between acting as if nothing had changed and making pointed comments about how my absence had complicated family gatherings. I noticed patterns I had previously accepted as normal. My father interrupting me mid-sentence, my mother subtly redirecting conversations away from my accomplishments, both of them deferring to James' opinions, even on topics where he had no expertise. On the second day, I calmly presented them with a list I had prepared, detailing specific instances of unequal treatment throughout my life, from childhood birthday disparities to the final birthday card that had catalyzed my departure. It was not delivered as an accusation, but as a reality I needed them to acknowledge if we were to have any relationship moving forward. My father reacted with defensive anger, dismissing my experiences, and suggesting I had always been determined to see myself as a victim. My mother tearfully insisted they had done their best, and that I was being unfair by quantifying parental love as if it were a balance sheet. I remained calm, neither arguing nor backing down. "I didn't come here for apologies or explanations," I told them. "I came because I needed you to hear my truth, even if you never accept it. What you do with this information is your choice, but pretending these disparities didn't exist is no longer an option if you want me in your lives." I left their house that evening and checked into a hotel, a symbolic declaration that I was no longer willing to stay in a space where my reality was denied. James met me for breakfast the next morning, away from our parents' influence. "They're in shock," he reported. "They've never had to face this so directly before." "Do you think anything will change?" I asked, not particularly hopeful. James considered the question carefully. "Maybe not dramatically or quickly, but you've disrupted their narrative for the first time. That's not nothing." We spent the day together, exploring old haunts and creating new memories as the people we were becoming rather than the roles we had been assigned. When I flew back to Seattle the next day, I carried a strange mix of sadness and liberation. The visit hadn't healed old wounds, but it had lanced them, bringing long, festering hurts into the open, where they could finally begin to properly heal. 2 years after booking that one-way flight from Boston, My life in Seattle had transformed beyond anything I could have imagined on that tearful birthday night. I had launched my own design studio, aptly named Second Wind, converted a small warehouse space in the Fremont neighborhood into a bright office with room for the two junior designers I had hired. My client list included businesses throughout the Pacific Northwest, with a growing reputation for revitalizing struggling brands through authentic storytelling. My personal life had blossomed in parallel with my professional success. Ryan and I were engaged after a year and a half of dating. Our relationship built on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than the performative partnerships I had forced myself into back east. Our engagement came on a rain-soaked hike, when neither of us could stop laughing about our terrible timing, soaking wet, but perfectly happy in the moment. My friendship circle had deepened and expanded, creating the kind of chosen family I had always craved. Zoe remained my closest friend, the person who had seen me at my lowest and helped me rebuild without judgment. The community I had created around myself was diverse in background and perspective, but united in valuing authenticity and mutual support. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something limited but more honest. After my confrontational visit, they had retreated into minimal contact for several months. When they eventually resumed regular calls, there was a tentative quality to their engagement, as if they were finally seeing me as an independent adult with the power to determine the terms of our relationship. They never directly acknowledged the lifetime of differential treatment, but small changes in their behavior suggested some impact from my boundary setting. My mother occasionally asked substantive questions about my business rather than treating it as a hobby. My father had stopped comparing my choices unfavorably to James. These were modest shifts, but significant given their entrenched patterns. James and I had developed a genuine sibling relationship for the first time in our lives. He had visited Seattle twice more since his hospital trip, once bringing his fiancée to meet me and explore the city I now confidently called home. During his Christmas visit, he shared that he had started therapy to address his own issues stemming from our family dynamics. I realized I was carrying all this guilt about how they treated you, he confessed as we walked along Alki Beach on a crisp December morning. Not just because I didn't stand up for you, but because some part of me believed I deserved the preferential treatment. Like I was somehow actually better or more worthy. Therapy had helped me process my own childhood wounds as well. I had found a counselor specializing in family trauma who helped me understand how the constant messages of being less worthy had shaped my self-perception in relationships. The work was painful, but essential for breaking patterns that had followed me even to Seattle. Working through that therapeutic process inspired me to start mentoring young designers, particularly those from backgrounds where their talents had been dismissed or undervalued. Seeing their confidence bloom as they received the support and recognition I had been denied was healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. One mentee, a brilliant young woman whose immigrant parents pressured her to pursue medicine, despite her passion for design, particularly resonated with my story. After I helped her secure her first professional design position, she sent me a note that brought tears to my eyes. "You showed me that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Sometimes the bravest thing is walking away from people who can't see your value." Her words crystallized what I had been learning through my journey, that success wasn't just about professional achievement or financial stability, but about defining worth on my own terms rather than accepting others' limited vision of me. Planning our wedding became an unexpected test of my growth and boundaries. Ryan and I wanted a small ceremony overlooking Puget Sound, with just our closest friends and family present. When I called my parents to share our plans, their response was predictably focused on appearances rather than our happiness. "But what will everyone think if you don't have a proper wedding back home where the family can attend?" My mother asked, distress evident in her voice. "Your cousin Jennifer had 400 guests at her reception." "This is the wedding we want, Mom," I replied calmly. "You and Dad are welcome to be there, but we're not changing our plans to meet others' expectations. That's not how I live my life anymore." My father got on the line then, his tone carefully measured. "Your mother is just concerned about family traditions, Tatiana. A small wedding in Seattle means most of the family won't be able to attend. I understand that, but this isn't about the extended family." It's about Ryan and me celebrating our commitment in the place and way that feels right for us. There was a pause before my father spoke again, his voice unusually thoughtful. You really have built a different life out there, haven't you? Yes, I have, I confirmed. A life where I get to determine what's right for me, not where I'm constantly trying to earn approval that never comes. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken acknowledgments. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I never meant to make you feel you weren't enough, Tatiana. She hesitated, then continued with difficulty. When you showed us that list during your visit last year of all the times the different ways we treated you and James, I didn't want to believe it, but I've been thinking about it ever since. And I keep remembering more examples you didn't even include. It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging the reality of my childhood. Not quite an apology, but a recognition that my experience had been valid rather than imagined or exaggerated, as she'd always claimed. Thank you for saying that, Mom, I replied, my throat tight with unexpected emotion. That means a lot to me. We ended the call with tentative plans for them to visit Seattle before the wedding to see my design studio and meet Ryan's family. It wasn't a complete resolution of our troubled history, but it was a step toward a more honest relationship, one built on who we actually were, rather than who they had always insisted I should be. That night, Ryan found me on our small balcony, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the water. You okay? He asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. I think I am, I answered, surprised to find it was true. For the first time, I had spoken my truth to my mother without either collapsing into people-pleasing or burning with resentment afterward. It felt like the culmination of a journey that had begun with that one-way ticket 2 years earlier. The healing wasn't complete, and perhaps never would be entirely. Some wounds run too deep to vanish without scars. But I had built a life where those scars no longer defined me or limited my choices. I had found people who valued me without qualification or comparison. I had created success on my own terms. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying to fight for approval that never comes. It's boarding a flight to find the person you were always meant to be, even when no one else could see her value. The family that matters is the one that sees you, even if you had to build it yourself. Have you ever had to walk away from something familiar to find your true worth? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear that sometimes choosing yourself is the most important decision you'll ever make. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, you are enough exactly as you are right now. No, maybe next year required.